what the courts will do in fact. That's what I do on the Dersh Show. And so you're going to hear from me an analysis, nonpartisan, objective, as to what's going to happen in each of the states in which challenges are going to be brought. You're not going to hear wishful thinking. You're not going to hear from me what I hope will happen, what conceivably could happen. You're not going to hear from me the kinds of analysis you get mostly on cable television, which are self-fulfilling, hope to be self-fulfilling prophecies. Well, if we argue that he's going to win hard enough, maybe he'll win. If we argue he's going to lose hard enough, maybe he'll lose. That's not the way the courts operate. In order to analyze decisions, you have to look at precedents. You have to look at the history. That's my job. When a client comes to me and asks me my advice, should I plead guilty? Should I go to trial? Should I appeal? Should I not appeal? I think of myself as the doctor, the surgeon, the radiologist, reading the MRI, reading the CAT scan, and making an objective assessment as to what the balance of probabilities are. Do we perform surgery? Do we give medication instead? You don't base your medical decisions on hope for outcomes. You base it on scientific research. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, going state by state. Let's start with Pennsylvania. There, I think President Trump's legal team has a good chance of prevailing legally, theoretically. Let's remember what the issue is there. The legislature decreed that all ballots that were filed before the close of business on Election Day must be received by the close of business on Election Day. And unless they are received by the close of business, even if they were postmarked earlier, they cannot be counted. Was that the right legislative decision? I don't think so. I think that ballots postmarked before the close of Election Day should be counted, regardless of when they're received, because it's not the fault of the voter that there may be a screw-up by the post office, whether or not accidental, inadvertent, or part of some grand conspiratorial plan. The point is the voter voted on time, and his vote should count. It would be as if the voter went to the polls, personally voted on time, and then somehow his ballot got stuck and it was found a day later. That should count if he voted on time in a timely fashion. There shouldn't be any difference between mail-in ballots and ballots cast in person. But that's not the way courts decide constitutional cases. If, in fact, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania exceeded its authority by extending the time for counting those votes by 3 days, President Trump will win that argument. Article 2 of the Constitution prevails over Supreme Court decisions by a state court. And although the Supreme Court decision may have been the right one from a moral point of view, from a political point of view, even from a Pennsylvania legal point of view, that may not be enough for the Supreme Court. And we already have a hint of that by the action of Justice Sam Alito. Justice Alito is the circuit justice for Pennsylvania. That is, each justice of the Supreme Court, in addition to having jurisdiction over cases coming before the court, has jurisdiction over a part of the United States. Sam Alito comes from the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, and so naturally he was assigned the Third Circuit, which includes Pennsylvania. Other justices are assigned other districts, mostly reflecting where they come from, but not always a perfect fit. And so a motion came before Justice Alito in his capacity as the circuit justice for Pennsylvania, asking him to order that the Secretary of State separately count and segregate all the votes that fit into this challenge. That is, all the votes that were postmarked prior to the close of business on Election Day, but received within 3 days thereafter. And those votes have now been segregated. The Secretary of State said it was being done previously, but now you have an order of a justice of the Supreme Court, which will not be disobeyed because it has the authority of the Supreme Court. So Justice Alito has hinted that there probably are other justices, because he wouldn't have done it if he was the sole justice who believed this, that there are other justices who may very well say those votes have to be discounted. That's not the end of the issue, though. It depends on how many votes there are. Let's assume, for purposes of argument, that there are 20,000 disputed votes, 20,000 votes that were postmarked before the close of Election Day but weren't received and counted until after, 20,000 votes that are challenged. And let's assume that those votes will be discounted by the United States Supreme Court. 5-4 decision, 6-3 decision, who knows? But what if Vice President Biden won the state by 30,000 votes and there are no other disputed ballots? He would still win Pennsylvania. And so the Supreme Court is unlikely to take the case and consider it, even if it's a winning argument, unless their decision could have impact. The Supreme Court does not like to decide theoretical cases. The Constitution, in fact, limits its jurisdiction to actual cases and controversies, which means they have to make a difference. They're not giving advisory opinions. They're not saying, well, those votes should count or shouldn't count. The only way they will decide the case is if it makes a difference in the outcome. If it makes a difference in the outcome of Pennsylvania. So the issue is now one of numbers. If the numbers of non-contested votes separating the winner from the loser is larger than the number of contested votes, the Supreme Court will decline review of the case. So if you ask me now, will the Supreme Court take that case? My answer will be, I can't tell you until I know the exact numbers. It now appears, on the basis of preliminary analysis and what was called by CNN and NBC and CNBC and MSNBC and Fox, what appears is that the number of uncontested votes in Pennsylvania that mark the difference between winning and losing is greater than the number of contested votes. If I'm right about that, then the Supreme Court will not take that case. But if I'm wrong about that, and if the number of contested votes exceed the difference, the margin of difference of victory, I believe they will take the case and will reverse it and will put Pennsylvania in the winning column for President Trump. Does that reverse his fortunes? Does that turn around the election? No, not alone. Winning Pennsylvania alone does not give him the 270 electoral votes if, in fact, there are successful challenges in Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. There are also going to be challenges in Michigan and perhaps other states as well. So we won't know whether or not the president has any chance of reversing the entire election results until we find out the margin of difference first in Pennsylvania and then find out the nature of the challenges in the other states. As far as I can see, and I've looked at the lawsuits, the challenges in the other states are mostly what I call retail challenges. The challenge in Pennsylvania is a wholesale challenge. It's a challenge based on the law, the Constitution, Article 2. You don't have to take any evidence. You don't have to hear any witnesses. You don't have to read any affidavits. You don't have to resolve factual disputes. We know that there were votes that were submitted after the close of business, and we will know the numbers without having a trial. So you don't need a trial in Pennsylvania, but you may very well need a trial in Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, because the challenges there are retail, not wholesale. They are not challenges based on the Constitution, based on differences of interpretation of Article 2 of the Constitution. They are challenges largely based on state law. Was there a right of poll watchers to stand within 10 feet or 6 feet? Those are micro issues, retail issues, that are questions of state law, not federal law, not constitutional law. Now, if you can prove that people were denied the right to vote on the basis of their race or gender or age, those are constitutional challenges. Those can be heard in federal court. But if your only challenge is they made you stand 20 feet away instead of 6 feet away, that's a state court challenge. That's a retail challenge. That will require evidence. The other side's going to say, no. We were allowing them to stay within 6 feet. And the answer may be, yeah, in some places they stood within 6 feet. In other places they stood 20 feet away. Those kinds of challenges are retail. They're case specific. They take evidence. They are messy, and they will take a long, long time. And my prediction based on Holmes's description of lawyers' role to predict what the courts will do in fact, is that those kinds of challenges will not produce a sufficient victory for President Trump to reverse the outcome of any other state. And unless there's a reversal in states in addition to Pennsylvania, there won't be enough changes to bring about the 270 electoral votes in the column of President Trump that he would need to declare victory and indeed to be declared the victor. So you're hearing it from me here, and you're hearing it not based on wishful thinking, not based on what I hope will be the outcome. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you that based on my best assessment of the lawsuits, based on my knowledge of the lawyers who are superb, the lawyers on the Trump defense team and on the Biden team are excellent lawyers. I know a lot of them. I've worked closely with a lot of them. They're going to make very strong and very powerful arguments. And by the way, no one should condemn any lawyer for making these arguments. We've heard also on the media condemnation of President Trump for bringing these lawsuits. No. Or for seeking a recount. No, that's part of the democratic system. That's part of our electoral system. Challenging the end result of an election, either by demanding a recount under state law, which is permitted in some states if it's 1%, in other states if it's 0.5%, some states even 0.1%. But whatever the law in the state is, don't condemn a losing candidate for bringing that challenge and seeking a recount. That's his or her right, and they shouldn't be condemned for exercising that right. Don't condemn the Trump legal team for bringing lawsuit challenges. That's also their right. The Bush legal team brought challenges in Florida in 2000. They won the challenges, and they won the election. And every lawyer should bring every challenge his client wants him to bring, as long as it's a plausible, realistic, ethical, non-frivolous challenge. And I think at least some of these challenges fit that description. So let's not get into the business of condemning lawyers, condemning the president, condemning anybody for exercising their constitutional, legal, political, moral right to take every possible challenge, use every possible mechanism for challenging. But in the end, here's the deal, to quote the next president of the United States. Here's the deal. If you're going to use the legal and political system to challenge the results, then you have to abide by the outcome of the legal challenges. So here is what President Trump must do if he's going to challenge in court. He should challenge, that's fine. But if he loses in court, he must accept that result. That's the bargain you strike when you go to court. I remember a case during the Vietnam War where a group of people challenged the constitutionality of the Vietnam War in court. In fact, I gave them some legal advice on that challenge, and they brought the case in front of the Supreme Court. Justice Potter Stewart was the circuit justice, and he issued some orders. But the question that was put to the litigants was, if you lose this challenge, and if the decision is that the Vietnam War is not unconstitutional, will you accept that result? And the litigants said, no, we don't care what the result is. We believe the Vietnam War is unconstitutional. And the court refused to take the case as the result of that. Because you can't, on the one hand, bring legal challenges, and on the other hand, say, I'm not going to accept the result of legal challenges. So a question that could and should be put by the courts in which these challenges are being issued to the lawyers for President Trump is the following. All right, you want us to hear the case. You want us to accept jurisdiction. Here's the deal. If we accept jurisdiction and we rule against your client, is your client going to accept the ruling of the court? And the answer to that question must be yes. That's the American way. Challenge? Sure. Protest? Sure. Demand a recount? Yeah. But in the end, accept the verdict. That's what you have to do. And I'm hoping that President Trump will do that. So you've heard my legal analysis. It may be right. It may be wrong. I think it's right. It may be wrong. It's possible. But it's not wrong because it's based on what I hope the outcome will be. I think it's going to be right because I've put aside any of my personal views and I've given you my strict, Holmesian legal analysis. This is what the courts will do, in fact. Judge me on that. Come back to me if I am wrong, and I'll have to explain and justify why I was wrong. But if I was wrong, it would not be because of my subjective hopes. It would be because my legal analysis was inaccurate. I think my legal analysis is accurate. I'm hoping to hear from you on The Dersh Show. Okay, now for your voices to be heard. Nick from New York.
I love your show. I have a quick question for you about the Constitution. If there's a clear process for amending the Constitution, how can someone say that it's up to interpretation and that its interpretation can change over time? Like, shouldn't any changes to the Constitution be passed as in the form of an amendment? And the second question would be that, do you think the federal government right now is too big? Like the current election, why would half the people Why should half the people be disappointed in the outcome rather than having any of these pressing issues being in the form of state and local powers?
Great questions. The framers of the Constitution made it very difficult to amend. We've only had a couple of dozen amendments from the beginning of time. Some of them are very technical amendments. Some of them bestowed rights, important rights, the right to vote for women, the right to vote for former slaves, the right to vote for people who are young. The amendments also cured some defects in the original Constitution about how you elect the president and the vice president. Very hard to amend the Constitution. And therefore, the Constitution also has some open-ended phrases that were put in there precisely because of the difficulty of amending. Equal protection, due process, cruel and unusual punishment. Those cry out for interpretation. And as Chief Justice John Marshall said early on, it's a constitution we're expounding, and therefore you have to look at the broad language of the Constitution, and it requires some interpretation. Obviously, if you want to change how old a president can be to be elected from 35, you can't interpret it. 35 is 35. It means 35 by American counting, not the way the Chinese count by your 1 year old on the day you were born. It's 35 actual years old. You can't interpret that away. If you think the age should be 40 or 30, you got to amend the Constitution. And so there's room for amendment and there's room for interpretation. That's why our Constitution has survived longer than any Constitution in the history of humankind. The next call is from Catherine.
Professor Dershowitz, I just saw your interview on Newsmax and I thought, thank God for Alan Dershowitz. Somebody just laid it out there about what's in play with potential election challenge lawsuits. It was so helpful. It was just such a public service, and certainly sounds like there are grounds for important legal challenges in a number of states, and the question about the Dominion software is huge, huge. So look forward to hearing more of what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much for your kind words. You can always hear me laying it out as if I were in the classroom. And remember, when I was a teacher for 50 years at Harvard, I never allowed my personal views to influence the way I taught students. I wouldn't try to teach students what to think. I would try to teach them how to think. I would lay out what I thought were the relevant considerations and let them decide. I didn't think that the lectern that was afforded me by Harvard Law School was an invitation to propagandize students. I think the same is true when I go on television. That's not an invitation to persuade people to my point of view. Or on this show, my point of view is my point of view. I vote in the secrecy of the ballot. But what you're going to hear from me always is a careful analysis and careful and thought through predictions. And so if that's what you want, I hope you'll come back and listen to the Dersh Show and ask me more questions. Great question. Thanks. Our next question is from California. Tom, what's your point?
Alan, you said you would side with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court regarding the issue of accepting ballots after the voting day. Since that appears to be ignoring black letter law, aren't you actually legislating instead of interpreting the law? Thank you.
Oh, you're 100% right. What I said was, in terms of policy, I thought extending the time for receiving ballots was the right policy decision, but the law is the law. There's a great story when a law clerk of Justice Holmes went to see him about an opinion that he was being written by Justice Holmes' office, and the law clerk said, "But this opinion is not just." And Holmes said, "Young man, we're not in the justice business, we're in the law business." Well, I don't agree with that. I think we're in both the law and the justice business. But if the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania didn't have the authority to do the right thing, then it didn't have the authority to do it. And so I'm not saying the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was right in changing legislation in the light of Article 2. I'm saying if we didn't have Article 2, if the question was just basically, should votes be allowed to be counted 3 days after they were cast? My answer would be yes, but that's not the legal answer under Article 2 necessarily. Our next call is from one of the contested states, Wisconsin. Tom.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. I'm calling in relation, in respect to that tweet about exaggerations on the left and on the right. It sounds like there's definitely exaggerations from both sides. And my question is along the lines of, assuming there is no voter fraud, the path forward is pretty clear. Votes count votes, and we're all done. But if there is fraud identified, is there any steps or anything that is possible to be done that would impact the outcome of the election? I think I understand that people that committed fraud would obviously be subject to some criminal charges, but if it doesn't impact the election, and it's just an important yet quite different issue than if it would impact the election.
Right.
Also, relative to the amount of fraud potential, if there's one or two ballots changed, someone cheated, all right, that's not going to really have much of an impact. But if you identify some larger amount of fraud, for example, if you think about it from the tip of the iceberg type standpoint, if you find a large batch of fraud, yet still not enough to have any impact on the outcome of the election, would there be any course of action to pursue relative to digging deeper and saying, hey, wait a second, if we found this, there might be more?
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, great topics. Really enjoy listening to you.
Well, those are great questions. People are going to be surprised at my answer. Fraud is not a federal issue. The Constitution doesn't protect against fraud. Fraud is a state issue. The states have the obligation to make sure that votes are not fraudulent. Look, if you had a massive amount of fraud and you could tell it really impacted the election and maybe it was done in a way that affected people based on race or gender, you could probably come up creatively with a federal argument. But generally, the issues relating to fraud or how the ballots are counted are generally state issues. Now, the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore federalized the hanging chads and other issues because they claimed it was a denial of equal protection for different counties to have different criteria for counting votes. I think that was the wrong decision, and I think most of the justices understand that was the wrong decision. I actually had an exchange of letters with my friend, Justice Scalia, about that, and in it, he didn't quite admit that the equal protection argument was a stretch, but he basically said, you know, we were under pressure, give me a break here. It was a very interesting exchange of letters I had with Justice Scalia. We also debated the issue both in Israel and in the United States. We argued ferociously, and yet we remained friends until the day he died. So the issues of fraud are mostly state issues. But you're right, of course, if you find systemic fraud, if you find fraud that not only affects a few votes, but systemic fraud, if you find in a city that they generally go to the cemeteries and get the names of dead people and allow them to vote, that's systemic fraud. Or if you find that people who've moved out of the state are allowed to vote and the votes are cast for them by opportunists from either party, that's systemic. Mostly still state rather than federal. You know, most lay people who haven't gone to law school don't have a complete and full understanding of how federalism works, and particularly how federalism works during presidential elections. It's very counterintuitive. You think a presidential election would be completely covered by federal law. No, a presidential election is 50 state elections, and under the Article 2 of the Constitution, the state legislatures determine how the electors are selected, subject to some ultimate review by the United States Supreme Court in very special circumstances, such as that allegedly occurred in Bush versus Gore. But this is very complicated, which is why my prediction is that in the end, the election will stand as it was called by the various networks. By the way, Vice President Biden is not president-elect in any technical sense yet. He's only president-elect by the vote of CNN, Fox, and the other networks who called the election. He becomes officially president-elect only after the Electoral College casts its votes, and 270 of them vote for Biden. He then becomes officially president-elect. But of course, the Secret Service is treating him as president-elect. The world is treating him as president-elect. He's gotten calls from, 140 world leaders. So, they follow the networks rather than the technicalities of the law. Our next call is from another one of the states that the pollsters got wrong, Ohio.
I was dismayed that ballots were allowed to be brought in Philadelphia, where the counting was going on in suitcases, plastic bags, and coolers in the middle of the night, around 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning. No Republicans were allowed to watch the process. And while one judge agreed to the demand of the Republicans, another judge overruled the same. And that's really astonishing. It's like what happens in countries of Africa and not the United States. I have many other questions, but I'll make it brief. I would wish that you, Alan, could help out in this, offer yourself to the president.
Well, thanks for your confidence. I am helping out. I'm helping out in the way that I help out best, by hoping to explain to the American people what's going on. I have expertise in this area. I partly litigated in the Bush versus Gore case many years ago. As you know, I also stood up in front of the Senate and opposed the impeachment of President Trump. But I'm not involved in this election case except as a commentator and as an expert analyst. And I'm going to continue to do that and follow with great care the outcome of this case. But you've heard my analysis and you've heard my predictions. Our final call today is from Ohio as well.
Why is it that while people were still in line voting in Arizona, that Fox News called Arizona for Joe Biden? And that's a big mistake. It would even dissuade people who were listening or watching to go further with the voting process, and it's unheard of.
Well, that's a good point. And there have been legislative proposals to not allow networks to call the outcome of elections while the polls are still open. That legislation might well be unconstitutional as a constraint on the right of networks to exercise their free speech. But I think today every network has made a decision not to call states while the polls are open. Now, it's a problem in Florida. Why? Because Florida is in 2 time zones. And so you might know the outcome of the election at a certain point in time after the polls closed, but the polls have only closed in Miami and Tampa and Fort Lauderdale. They haven't closed in the panhandle part of the state, in the extreme western part of the state. And I remember in Bush versus Gore, Justice O'Connor was at a party the night of the election, and she fumed out in fury when the networks called Florida for Al Gore, and there were complaints. She's a justice of the Supreme Court. Why is she screaming and yelling about the outcome of the election, and her excuse, which I to this day don't believe to be true, but her excuse is, oh, no, she wasn't complaining about the outcome of the election. She was complaining about the fact that the network called it while there were still polls open in Western Florida. Whether that was the reason or not is not relevant. It was a good point. She made a good point. Networks shouldn't call elections until all the polls are closed, because you don't want networks to have an influence on people staying home. Look, President Trump has argued that the polls themselves were rigged to discourage Republicans from voting. Let the public judge that. The polls were so inaccurate that anybody who doesn't vote based on polls is a fool. You vote no matter what the polls say, because the polls have been wrong as often as they've been right. But look, we are a divided country. 70 million people are going to be disappointed as the result of this election. More people voted for Biden than ever voted for any presidential candidate in history. But the second most votes for any presidential candidate in history have gone to Donald Trump. So we are a deeply divided country, and I'm hoping that everybody, the judges, the election workers, you name it, the candidates especially, will do whatever they can to bring people together. I actually thought that Vice President Biden's speech, what he called his acceptance speech, was good. I think it did a good job in trying to offer compromise and bring people together. In the event that President Trump makes a concession speech, we're not sure he will. There are rumors swirling about whether he will or not. And whether he does it now or after all the results are in, if he still does not prevail, I hope he too will reach out in the interests of compromise. Disappointed as he is, angry as he may be, he may still, in the depths of his heart, believe the election was stolen from him, but he has an obligation as a candidate to try to heal America's wounds. We are a deeply wounded and deeply divided country, and as a patriotic American who loves his country, I hope we can come together and move forward. That's the Dersh Show. Love your calls, love your input. As I've said, the Dersh Show needs the wits, and the wits come from the callers. And when the wits come in, we have the Dersh Show, and it becomes Dersh Show Wits. So thank you for your input, your wits, your calls, and come back and listen to more of the Dersh Show, because you'll hear more careful analysis, objective, and as I've said before, you'll never be bored. An important part of the Dersh Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on the Dersh Show.